This is the space for your thoughts.
If there was ever a time to bring out a boring black suit, this year's Met Gala was it. Though of course I've come to realize that there's nothing boring about a black suit, but suiting and just the idea of tailoring is relatively new to the African context. So much of historical African fashion is defined by the fact that it isn't tailored. Instead of cloth that is cut, shaped and stitched together, what you often find is fabric folded, knotted and wrapped around the body. And when thinking about this year's theme of tailoring and menswear in relation to the Black Dandyism exhibit, I was looking at how much Western menswear is the result of padding, interlining and complex stitch work, which got me thinking about how I could merge these opposing approaches to construction and body modification. And then I came across an anecdote from my favorite British royal of all time. Prince Philip, may he rot in peace, once said to the Nigerian president that he looked ready for bed. He was wearing an agbada. And while these are generally billowing, drapey garments, so much so that Queen Elizabeth's husband mistook them for pajamas, there's lots of instances of incredibly structured takes on the robe, which funnily enough share visual similarities with the styles favoured by the Tudor court in the 15th century. Both the agbada and the court ensembles of Britain in this time are quite similar in their silhouette, sharing these broad shoulders, the flowing robes, and then paired with trousers and hats.
Back pant, front pant, waistband, pocket pouches, bags, fly front, fly shield. That's pants done. Then we have facing for the agbada. This is the front, two front agbada pieces. This is our front and back lining pieces, upper collar, welt pocket facing, lining for the under collar roll thing, under collar, pocket bag for that welt. These giant circles are going to get turned into shoulder pads, and then these are two back panels. And this has taken about 8 hours. I want to cry.
I wanted to start with the less intimidating aspect of this, which would be a pair of wide leg shorts, my middle ground between Sokoto and pumpkin hose, mostly determined by the fact that I only have 3 meters of fabric.
This is exactly what I feared. Oh my god. Look, Kashmir, how could you do this? Just not give a fuck.
These would have a fly front zipper, which I haven't done in years, pockets, and be fitted around the waist with either darts or gathers. I figured I'd decide after trying them on.
This is just everything pinned together, so I have to move super carefully. These aren't as full at the hem as I would have liked, but I did have fabric limitations, so that's okay. I think what I will go with is maybe like 1 or 2 pleats at the front. I was playing around with doing like a crease line like you see in a lot of really tailored pants, but this fabric is really thick and hard to iron, so I think I'm going to skip it. So I think I'll do just 2 little pleats in the front, and then at the back, which surprisingly fits quite well, I'm going to do like a lot of small little pleats there. I did consider gathering it, but this fabric again is so thick. But yeah, I'm really happy with the length though. That's great. I just wish these were much fuller, but what can you do? But also I think because it's pinned right now, it's hard to tell like how full these are. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. But otherwise though, it's looking pretty good in terms of like, I mean, it's pinned, so it's not the best example. But like the crotch is holding up pretty well. I'm not getting any bubble butt. So yeah.
As a clothing category, I do my best to avoid making and wearing pants, especially fitted ones. The nature of bifurcating a garment and having it form around the crotch creates a lot of complexity that I find no joy in making, and as someone with an incredibly small bladder, even less pleasure in wearing.
Okay, so this is my favorite way to sew pants, where you have your 2 separate legs done, and then you take the one and you put it right side to right side in the other one. Okay, it's a little bit easier with different fabric, but yeah. Then you just want to match our seam, so we want to make sure. There we go. get our center front, meet in here in the middle. So, let's pin that for now. Oh, this is gonna be so thick to sew, but okay, it'll be fun. And then this is our center back crotch seam. Yeah. Now this method's a little bit easier when you don't have like a front closure going on, but it's not impossible and I still prefer it. It is much easier when you are working with like a fly front and things like that to work by sewing your like front pieces together, then sewing them to your back pieces, as opposed to sewing the left front to the left back and the right back to the right front. But this is just the best way I can get around this, because then also the cool thing is you get to just sew all of this in one curve. But we do have a fly front here, so usually if there wasn't anything going on here on the front, I would just go all the way around here. But I'm going to be sewing from about here. I have a little step in the fabric as a marker, so I'm going to be sewing from there, then all around. And my steps match up perfectly, yay! For the sake of like thinking about my future self or anyone who might have a garment after me, I do like to have really big seam allowances. So anything from like 1.5 centimeters to 2.5. But on this fabric, I am regretting that decision just because I just didn't think it was going to be so bulky and thick. So if you are going to do something like this, I would recommend a much smaller seam allowance than I've been using today, but also not the end of the world. But I just like the idea that if at some later point I have like extra room to let everything out, or if I want to take this apart, then there's extra fabric to work with. And that's just something that I come into because I take apart a lot of garments often. And it's really good when there is like excessive seam allowance to play with, which is something you don't see in a lot of like mass manufactured modern things now. I think some people are under the idea that like using less seam allowance is a way to conserve fabric, but sometimes you do have to sort of have a bit of like mechanical waste in a project to ensure its longevity. Ready to start sewing. Another thing I would also suggest is just reducing your stitch length a little bit. The crotch area is a place that goes under a lot of stress, so you do want some extra reinforcement. So I'm probably going to backstitch this like twice instead of just once. Especially because also all the movement from like the zip opening and closing can really stress these seams. You can also reinforce this with like some tape, some binding and stuff, but again, I'm working with a lot of bulk. We've stitched all the way around our curve. I had a little skip over there, but I think it should be fine. And then now you just pull your one leg out. Boom. You now have a bifurcated garment. And then I just need to check that everything looks fine from the front. Pull that again inside out. Ugh, these are so big. Yay. I think I'm gonna stitch a little bit further up here by my crotch. I don't trust that. But yeah, I don't think I'll be killing myself today.
This is a synthetic melted wool, which isn't too dissimilar to what's used in suiting, but when it's flat, it's deceptively drapey, only to become incredibly thick and bulky when sewn. So in my hubris, I figured I could just make the panels of my trousers really wide and do the kind of gathering you get away with on a skirt. This was also keeping with the less tailored way that like Sokoto is structured. But after looking at another pair of tailored wool pants I have, I realized I should have spent a little bit more time shaping the pants closer to the proportions of my body, and that I could have also used a lot of thinner layers for things around the fly front. What I ended up doing was a lot of over tailoring here. I also had trouble with how this was pulling at the crotch, either from the excess fabric or not properly ironing out a crease. We'll never know. I repeatedly had to test out different variations of gathers, pleats, or darts, which involved a lot of pinning, basting, trying on, crying, and repeating. What should have been done in 8 hours ended up consuming 16 hours of my life. And mind you, I've started this whole thing like 4 days before the Met Gala, with the fantasy of being able to be complete by Sunday with enough time to shoot, edit, and post about everything for the first Monday in May. I haven't done a lot of tailoring in my life. Actually, the most was for my last Met Gala project over 3 years ago, but I remember getting a lot of kicks out of all this finicky handwork. I think there's something quite poetic about how, while appearing simple or boring, much of what makes a suit is a lot of complex and careful stitching that goes unseen in the final product. And to the untrained eye, men covertly get away with much of the same body modification as women. It's kind of like how black people have for so long made the most contributions to culture and industry but remain uncredited and unrecognized for it, while those in positions of power get to behave like it all came so naturally to them. Of course, leave it to me to look at something as simple as a giant rectangle and complicated. To ensure the lapels turn over, I'm using a technique called pad stitching, which basically involves sewing two pieces together on a curve. You make these tiny little stitches through your top fabric, the interlining fabric, that only catch a thread or two of the outer fabric that's on the bottom. And you're essentially forcing the bigger curve of your outer fabric to shrink to the smaller curve of your interlining, and that keeps it in a permanently curved shape. It's a little bit easier to do than to explain, and there are also very many great tutorials online, so you don't have to trust me on this. Keeping with the tailored look, I added 2 diagonal welt pockets to the front, which is usually a really fun process. Like, the entire way you make welts is kind of like a magic trick. But because of how bulky this fabric was and how much I was over tailoring, it was incredibly difficult to pull over and iron flat the welts. And also, this fabric does not take to heat really well, so I had to use a lot of water throughout this process, and I'm kind of feeling a little bit guilty about that. But I did accidentally burn the front of my pants, so it was quite essential. Of course, it's my fault for forgetting that there is no such thing as a simple garment, something I have been painfully reminded of throughout this whole project. We've got to remember that even something as humble as the t-shirt took centuries of engineering and creativity to achieve, a culmination of farming, geometry, art theory, and more. To create my shoulder pads, I had cut out 2 large circles, which would then be filled with a bunch of scrap fabric. Stuffing and quilting things is possibly my most favorite thing to do. I cannot tell you why, maybe it's just because I really enjoy it. So I think I might have been a bit too excited about how thick I was making these. These circles get the shoulder pad shape by folding them in half, and then the stuffing is kept in place with quilting. You want to concentrate most of the thickness at the middle of the circle, which once folded will be the outer edge of the shoulder pad, and then it also sort of tapers in when you get towards the neckline. I found some scraps of fleece that I thought would act as a good buffer between the shoulder pads and the outer fabric, so that you wouldn't see any harsh lines in the end, and then I pad stitched those in place. At this point, I had been up for like 24 hours straight, which is never a good idea, and somehow made a series of delirious, stupid decisions.
I'm trying to decide if this is one of those things that, like, I can live with, or if I should just give up and throw myself off a bridge.
Cool. What the heck? I think my only option right now, because I don't have any more fabric here, so I think I have to try and make this side match that. But I'm also going to give it a second and see if I can live with it. No, I'm going to kill myself. Oh my goodness. It's so bad.
It's hideous. Like, it looks terrible. But at least if I match it on the other side, I could pretend it's a design choice. But also at the same time, it's like, you know what? I'm not a professional tailor. This is like the 3rd time in my life I am making a blazer. And you know, part of the beauty of home sewing is like imperfection. Like, I'd love to see ChatGPT do this. Okay, but you know what? I always feel like my #1 rule in sewing is like, you don't have to be perfect and you don't have to be right, but you do need to be consistent. So, as much as it pains me, I'm going to make both lapels hideous. And yeah, we'll just have to pretend it's a design choice. But yeah, man, mad respect to professional tailors. But honestly, despite how stressful all this has been and all the mistakes I've made, this makes me really actually want to take the time to properly like sit down and start learning more tailoring techniques, because this stuff is so cool and crazy, but like, it's clearly the kind of thing that takes years of practice. Stuff makes corsetry like a freaking walk in the park, honestly.
Why is it that every time I think a project will be easy, it's like the devil starts to rub his hands together? You're not Birdman! Moving on to my next problem, however, which is that the weight of my shoulder pads was causing the agbada to collapse in the back. The whole point of this is to really create that defined rectangle around my body. And since the wiser thing would have been to just remove the shoulder pads, thin them out, and then put them back in, I instead opted to make another bigger shoulder pad. This time I'd be stretching further into the shoulder blades to provide more support. Now, it would have probably been more beneficial to have an extra layer of interlining on all of this, but I was very frustrated, very tired, and in a rush for no good reason. So I was kind of just working on reserve mode with a lot of my decision making here. Once again, the process is the same, in which I layer a bunch of scrap fabrics onto a piece of cloth. I'm trying to keep them somewhat uniform in their thickness and level it out, but this is more of a vibe than it is a science. Then doing several rows of straight stitching around. It's amazing how much structure you can give to a piece of cloth just through the act of stitching, which I find such great joy in every time.
It's quite subtle. So this is the side with the extra padding. This is the side without it. But look at that. That is actually standing at a much straighter line. Importantly, at the back, it's not collapsing on itself as much. It's actually able to hold shape. There, I've just finished pad stitching my one new pad inside. But look at the difference in how this is holding out shape now. Oh my god. Turning out a tube and it just looks...
At this point, it was a couple hours before the Met Gala, so all that was left was just to attach the lining, remove basting stitches, do hemming, which I decided to do in bed while watching the actual event.
I am watching the Met Gala, but someone brought in a bird they didn't finish killing. Oh, I guess it's dying now.
Oh my god, I'm only realizing now that bird had its legs ripped off. Oh my goodness.
Dude, finish it.
So I had to go back to bed where it was safe and there was no dying animals. At the most basic level, tailoring refers to making clothing fit an individual, and beyond just the way we've seen various African subcultures using things like suiting, a lot of the fashions disseminated onto black people through trade, slavery, colonization are all incredibly tailored. There are so many interesting ways this is done, especially with malicious compliance, which is something I was really hoping to see more of at this year's Met Gala, and not so much that it has to be specifically African, but even in the American context, for example, I think it would have been really cool to see how people explore crafts and techniques of African American tailors and seamstresses. There are these beautiful traditions of quilting, which actually A$AP Rocky had referenced back in 2021. I was also surprised at the lack of upcycling, since Monica Almiller, who not only co-curated the exhibition but authored the book that inspired it, has discussed the way enslaved and emancipated people would collect scraps, offcuts, or waste materials to embellish clothing as a way to add a sense of individuality to uniform and to connect with the cultural traditions from which they were separated. In the end, I can't say I'm 100% happy with what I've produced, but mostly because I have such an immense respect for tailoring in both Western and African contexts, and I'd hate to make a mockery of all that work, but at the same time I will be kind to myself because this is a craft that takes people many years to learn and master, and now I get to think of them whenever I wear this, and I'm reminded of how powerful and transformative fashion is, not just in how we look and visually communicate, but that every stitch, every thread, every bead is the amalgamation of centuries of human spirit and power that I get to embody as a second skin. I'm not gonna lie, I look fucking dapper, bro.